What happens when a powerful CEO confronts an unexpected truth that shatters his world? Embark on a gripping story of transformation and redemption that reveals the hidden strength in humanity and humility. His immaculate high-gloss shoes clicked on the pavement with a sharp, measured rhythm as he advanced along the vibrant city street. His jaw was clenched, a prominent vein pulsating near his temple. The failed corporate deal churned in his thoughts, each stride intensifying his irritation. He navigated through the bustling throng, his bespoke attire a protective shell of achievement, amidst a sea of ordinary people. Yet today that shell felt insubstantial. The significant contract was meant to be his crowning glory, solidifying his firm as the undisputed leader in its domain. But now it had slipped through his grasp like grains of sand. As he neared his office tower, its reflective facade seemingly mocking his setback, he noticed a figure hunched on the sidewalk. The sight of the unkempt man holding a piece of cardboard ignited a fresh surge of annoyance. Veteran in need, the sign declared in clumsy handwriting. His lip curled. He had forged his empire through relentless effort and fierce resolve. The notion that someone would beg rather than elevate themselves through their own efforts offended his core beliefs. Without breaking his stride, he scowled down at the individual. Get a job, you good-for-nothing mendicant. He spat, his voice dripping with disdain. He anticipated the usual reaction: anger, humiliation, or pathetic pleas. Instead, the man looked up, meeting his gaze with calm, unwavering eyes. Life can take an unexpected turn, friend, the man said softly. You never know where you'll end up. The unforeseen response startled him. For a fleeting moment, uncertainty flickered in his mind, but he swiftly suppressed it, fury mounting in its place. You know nothing about me, he retorted, taking a threatening step closer. His voice escalated, drawing the attention of passers-by. How dare you lecture me, you squalid. Hey, let's calm down, a female voice interjected, cutting through his tirade. A young woman with gentle eyes stepped between them, her stance non-aggressive but firm. There's no call for this. His nostrils flared. This is none of your concern, he snarled, waving her off dismissively. The woman, Jessica, her name tag read, stood her ground. I volunteer at the shelter, she explained, gesturing towards the homeless man. I know Mark, he's a decent person who's fallen on hard times. There's no need for insults. Her words only fueled his rage. The day's frustrations coalesced into a blazing inferno of fury. Without deliberation, he shoved Mark forcefully. The older man stumbled backward, falling heavily to the ground. Gasps erupted from the growing circle of onlookers. Jessica rushed to help Mark up, casting a look of shocked disbelief his way. For an instant, he felt a surge of malicious satisfaction. But as Mark steadied himself, leaning on Jessica for support, he looked directly at him. Your father wouldn't have wanted this, Mark said quietly. The words struck him like a physical blow. He staggered back, mind reeling. What? How do you know my father? Mark's eyes held a hint of sorrow. We served together, he said simply. He saved my life once. I never imagined his son would treat a veteran this way. The revelation shattered his world. His father, the man he had idolized, the standard he had held himself to, knew this unhoused individual impossible. And yet a memory surfaced. His father speaking of an old war companion he'd lost touch with, a man named Mark. You're lying, he growled, but the words lacked conviction. Jessica's eyes widened as she noticed something glinting beneath Mark's jacket. Are those dog tags? Mark nodded, pulling out the metal identification tags. 25 years in the Marines, he said. Decorated combat veteran. The crowd murmured, the tide of opinion visibly shifting. He felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. His meticulously crafted image of superiority crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. His heart pounded against his chest, his mind reeling from Mark's unforeseen disclosure. He forced a dismissive laugh, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, struggling to maintain his composure. Jessica, the young volunteer, sensed the change in the atmosphere. Her eyes locked onto Mark, urging him, gently, tell us what happened. Mark's weathered face softened, his gaze distant, as he began to narrate a tale that shook him to his very core. It was during the Battle of Fallujah. Mark started, his voice low but steady. Your father's unit down by heavy enemy fire. He felt the crowd lean in, their collective breath held. As Mark's story unfolded, he described the pandemonium of the battlefield, the acrid scent of gunpowder, the deafening roar of explosions. His father, then a young lieutenant, had been separated from his team. I saw him there alone and exposed. Mark continued, the enemy was closing in. I knew I had to act. As Mark recounted his audacious rescue, his mind raced. His father had always been reticent about his military service, but there had been hints, vague references to a comrade who'd saved his life. He had dismissed them as exaggerations, never imagining they'd return to haunt him like this. "We made it out," Mark concluded, his eyes refocusing on him. "Your father got a Purple Heart." "I got this." He tapped his leg, and for the first time he noticed the slight stiffness in Mark's gait. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. He tried to mask his discomfort with a stern expression, but he felt exposed, vulnerable. The crowd around them had expanded, and he could sense their mood shifting. Sympathetic murmurs rippled through the onlookers, punctuated by disapproving glances cast his way. His entire worldview teetered on the brink of collapse. His life had been built on the bedrock of his own perceived superiority, his wealth, his influence, his unshakable rectitude. But now confronted with the man who had saved his father's life, a man he had carelessly insulted and shoved to the ground, he felt that foundation crumbling beneath his feet. The pressure of the crowd's judgment weighed heavily on him. Some faces showed anger, others disappointment. Always so in control, he found himself floundering. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged. Mark continued his narrative, describing his struggles after returning home. "The nightmares were the worst," he said quietly, "and then trying to find work. It was like the skills that kept me alive over there meant nothing back here." Suddenly, a gasp cut through the murmurs. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, her eyes wide with recognition. "I remember you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You were in the newspaper a few years ago, a veteran who couldn't find a job despite all you did for this country." The woman's words triggered a cascade of recognition. More voices joined in piecing together Mark's identity. "I saw that story too." Someone else called out, "It was a disgrace how they treated you. War hero." Another voice said the words, rippling through the crowd, "Decorated veteran." He watched in growing dismay as the tide of public opinion swelled unmistakably in Mark's favor. The pity and disdain that had colored their initial reactions to the unhoused man had transformed into respect and admiration. Each nod of recognition, each murmured word of support, felt like another nail in the coffin of his pride. He could no longer dismiss Mark's story as a fabrication. The evidence was mounting, undeniable, his mind flooded with conflicting emotions. Guilt for his actions, shame at his arrogance, and a desperate clinging need to salvage some shred of his dignity. But as the crowd's support for Mark grew, he felt himself being painted ever more clearly as the villain of this impromptu street drama. His carefully cultivated image of the successful, magnanimous businessman was crumbling before his eyes. The pressure built a crushing weight on his chest. He couldn't bear it any longer. Enough of this. He shouted, his voice cracking with strain. He shoved his way through the crowd, desperate to escape, to find some quiet place where he could gather his thoughts and regain control. But the crowd, now fully aligned with Mark, closed ranks around him. A burly man grabbed his arm, his grip firm. "You can't just walk away from this." The man growled. Others joined in, their voices rising in a cacophony of demands. "Listen to him. You owe him an apology. Face what you've done." He struggled against their hold, panic rising in his throat. He'd never felt so powerless, so utterly out of control. His usual tactics, intimidation, dismissal, the sheer force of his personality, were useless. Here these people, ordinary citizens he would have ignored on any other day, had become a force he couldn't reckon with. A scuffle broke out as he tried to break free. Hands grabbed at his expensive suit, voices rose in anger. His world narrowed to a blur of faces and grasping hands. He was no longer the respected CEO, the man whose very presence commanded respect here in this moment. He was just a man being forced to face the consequences of his actions. Just as the situation threatened to spiral into chaos, a new voice cut through the din. "I know who you are," it said, calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. The crowd fell silent, parting to reveal an older man. His face was lined with age, but his posture was ramrod straight, hinting at a military past. He stepped forward, his eyes moving from Mark to him. "I served with both of them," the man said, his voice heavy with memory. "Mark. And your father." He felt the fight drain out of him, replaced by a creeping dread. The old man's gaze was piercing, filled with disappointment that cut him to the quick. "Your father spoke of you often," the man continued, addressing him directly. "He was so proud of you, always bragging about his brilliant son." He paused, the weight of unspoken judgment hanging in the air. "But he also spoke of Mark. Said he was the bravest man he knew, the kind of man you could trust with your life." The words hit him like physical blows. Each one stripped away another layer of his defenses, leaving him raw and exposed. He thought of his father, the man he'd always striven to impress to surpass how many times had he dismissed his father's old war stories as irrelevant to the cutthroat world of business. But now faced with the living embodiment of those stories, he was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. He hadn't just insulted a stranger today. He'd betrayed the very values his father held dear. The realization crashed over him in a wave of shame. His carefully constructed world, built on the bedrock of his own superiority, lay in ruins around him. He was left standing amid the wreckage, faced with the stark reality of his own arrogance and the consequences of his actions. The crowd watched in intense silence, waiting to see how he would respond. But for once in his life, the CEO, Harvard MBA master of the boardroom, was at a complete loss for words. His world crumbled around him as Samuel's words echoed through the tense air. The older man's eyes clouded with memories bored into his soul. "After the war, your father tried to find Mark," Samuel said, his gravelly voice heavy with regret. "But the chaos of post-war life made it difficult. He searched for years, but eventually lost track of him." Each word hammered another nail into his coffin of guilt. The weight of his father's unfulfilled promise settled on his shoulders, threatening to crush him. The silence of the crowd pressed in, suffocating him with their unspoken demands. His mind raced desperately, grasping for a lifeline. His father, the man he'd idolized his entire life, had failed Mark too. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd always seen his father as infallible, a paragon of success and integrity. Now, that image shattered, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The crowd's eyes bore into him, their collective gaze a silent accusation. He felt the walls close. Both physically and emotionally, time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Each second, an eternity of judgment. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he searched for a way out. His privileged mind latched onto the most obvious solution. "Throw money at the problem. I'll help you," he blurted out, his voice cracking with desperation and a hint of determination. "I'll take you to a shelter. Make sure you get what you need." The words left a bitter taste in his mouth. Even as he said them, it was a band-aid on a bullet wound. And he knew it. But it was all he could think of in the moment, his panicked brain grasping at straws. Jessica, standing nearby, immediately sensed the inadequacy of his proposal. Her eyes narrowed, disappointment etched across her face. "A shelter isn't enough," she said firmly, her voice cutting through his flimsy offer. "Mark needs something real, something permanent." The crowd murmured in agreement, a soft rumble of discontent that sent shivers down his spine. He realized with stark clarity that if he truly wanted to atone for his actions, he must go beyond a quick fix. This wasn't a problem he could solve by writing a check or making a phone call. Jessica's gaze softened slightly as she saw the realization dawning in his eyes. "What Mark needs is a home," she continued, her voice gentler now, "and a job, something that will give him the stability and dignity he deserves." He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. The magnitude of what Jessica was suggesting hit him like a freight train. It wasn't just about today or tomorrow or next week. It was about fundamentally changing a man's life, and by extension his own. He nodded slowly, the reluctance evident in every line of his body. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was a glimmer of something else, hope, perhaps a chance at redemption, a way to right the wrongs of both the past and the present. Taking a deep breath, he turned to Mark. The homeless man's weathered face was impassive, giving nothing away. He licked his lips nervously, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Mark," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "I'd like to help, not just with a shelter, but with a home and a job, something permanent." Like Jessica said, the words hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. For a moment, he dared to hope that this would be enough, that his offer would be accepted, and this nightmare would end. But Mark's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching. When he spoke, his voice was cold enough to freeze the summer air around them. "I don't want your charity," Mark said, each word precise and cutting. "Not from someone who looks down on me." The crowd held its collective breath, the tension ratcheting up another notch. Taken aback by the vehemence in Mark's voice, he stumbled over his words. "But I'm trying to help," he protested weakly. "I want to make things right." Mark's laugh was bitter, devoid of any real humor. "Make things right," he repeated incredulously. "You think throwing money at me will erase what you've done, what you've said?" He felt his face flush with shame and frustration. He didn't understand why Mark wouldn't accept his help. In his world, money solved everything, but here in this moment, he was realizing that there were some things money couldn't buy. "Then, what do you want?" he demanded, his own temper flaring. "I'm offering you a chance to get off the streets, to have a real life again." Why won't you take it? Mark's eyes flashed dangerously. Because I'm not a problem for you to solve, Mr. Harrington. I'm a human being, and until you can see me as one, until you can look at me without that disgust in your eyes, your help means nothing. The words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, the truth of Mark's statement cutting through his defenses. For the first time, he truly saw the man standing before him not as a homeless vagrant, not as a charity case, but as a person with dignity, with pride, with a story that he had never bothered to consider. The realization broke something inside him. The carefully constructed walls of his privileged worldview came crashing down, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Tears sprang to his eyes, unbidden and unwelcome. I'm sorry, he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been wrong, so wrong, not just today, but for so long. The admission cost him dearly, each word dragged from the depths of his soul. But as they left his lips, he felt something shift inside him, a weight lifted, replaced by a crushing sense of responsibility. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he, titan of industry and pillar of high society, broke down before their eyes. It was a moment of raw humanity, stripping away the veneer of wealth and status. Reveal the flawed, struggling man beneath. Just as he began to believe he was making progress, finally addressing his own faults and offering sincere help, Mark delivered a final devastating revelation. Your father never lost track of me, Mark said quietly. But the words cut through the air like a knife. We've been in contact all these years. He knew where I was, knew my situation, but he didn't know how to reach out to you. The crowd fell into stunned silence, and his world tilted on its axis. The revelation shattered any remaining illusions he had about his relationship with his father, and the values he thought they shared. His mind reeled, unable to process this new information. His father, the man he spent his entire life trying to emulate, to impress, had known about Mark's struggles all along, and never said a word. That can't be true, he stammered, his voice barely audible. My father would have told me, he would have done something. Mark's eyes softened slightly, a flicker of pity crossing his weathered features. Your father is a complicated man. Mark said he wanted to help, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap between us and your world. He was afraid of disappointing you. I think the irony of that statement was not lost on him. All his life, he'd been afraid of disappointing his father. And now he learned that his father had been equally afraid of disappointing him. This revelation completely upended his understanding of his own family. The emotional distance that had always existed between father and son suddenly took on new meaning. He realized that his relationship with his father, which he always considered a pillar of his identity, was far more complex and fractured than he ever imagined. The weight of this realization, coupled with the events of the day, proved too much for him to bear. His legs gave out beneath him, and he stumbled back, barely catching himself against a nearby wall. The crowd, sensing his inner turmoil, remained silent, giving him the space to process the bombshell that had just been dropped. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of his life that had now been shattered. Images flashed through his mind. His father's proud smile at his business successes, the distant look in his eyes during family dinners, the way he always seemed to be searching for something more. He had always attributed it to his father's drive for success. Now he wondered if it was guilt that haunted the older man's eyes. Finally unable to hold back any longer, he slid down the wall, his knees hitting the pavement hard. Tears streamed down his face, unchecked and unashamed. I didn't know, he choked out, his voice raw with emotion. I didn't know how much I've lost, how much I failed. The admission hung in the air, a testament to his complete vulnerability. The crowd, which had been so critical of him earlier, now watched in stunned silence. They saw him not as a villain, but as a deeply flawed man, struggling to come to terms with his own failings. Mark stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He knelt down beside him, his presence both a comfort and a rebuke. It's not too late, Mark said softly, to make things right, to be better. He looked up, his eyes redrimmed and desperate. How he asked the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime of mistakes. Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he held out his hand, the same hand he had sneered at earlier. Now it represented a lifeline, a chance at redemption. After a moment's hesitation, he took it. Over the following weeks, he threw himself into making amends with a fervor that surprised even himself. His first step was to reach out to Jessica, the volunteer from the shelter. She was understandably wary at first, but his sincerity eventually won her over. Under Jessica's guidance, he started volunteering at the shelter. The work was grueling, and often heartbreaking, a far cry from the cushy boardrooms he was used to, but with each passing day, he felt a little piece of his old self chip away, replaced by something new and unfamiliar. He met other veterans, listened to their stories, and for the first time in his life, truly heard them. The weight of their experiences humbled him, making his own problems seem trivial in comparison. He found himself staying late at the shelter, offering not just his time, but his full attention and empathy. One evening, as he helped serve dinner at the shelter, he caught sight of his reflection in a tarnished serving tray. The man staring back at him was almost unrecognizable, hair must suit replaced by a stained apron, hands rough from manual labor, but his eyes were alive in a way they hadn't been in years. His efforts extended beyond the shelter. He reached out to his father's old military contacts, seeking to understand more about the veterans community and their needs. He attended support group meetings, not as a speaker or figurehead, but as a silent observer there to listen and learn. His actions were met with cautious optimism from the community. There were still those who eyed him with suspicion, waiting for the mask to slip and reveal the old him. Days turned into weeks, and his commitment remained unwavering. Even the skeptics began to soften. One particularly challenging day at the shelter, he found himself face to face with a young veteran who reminded him painfully of himself, at that age, arrogant, entitled, angry at the world. The interaction left him shaken, forcing him to confront the person he used to be. That night, he sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that once seemed so important. Now they felt hollow, meaningless, compared to the connections he'd forged at the shelter. For the first time, he truly understood the emptiness of his former life. As the weeks passed, his reputation slowly began to rebuild, not as a wealthy businessman or powerful CEO, but as someone who genuinely cared and was willing to put in the work to make a difference. It was a different kind of respect than he was used to, but he found it infinitely more satisfying. One quiet afternoon, as he was helping Jessica sort through donations at the shelter, she pulled him aside. Her expression was serious, and he felt a flicker of anxiety. Had he done something wrong? Was his presence no longer welcome? Richard, Jessica began, her voice low. There's something you need to know. He braced himself, expecting the worst, but nothing could have prepared him for what came next. Mark was aware of who you were from the start, Jessica revealed. He and your father, they planned this encounter. It was meant to be a lesson. The words hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled back, gripping the edge of a nearby table for support. What he managed to choke out. Jessica's eyes were sympathetic, but firm. Mark knew exactly who you were and what you represented. This whole situation, it was a test, a way to force you to confront your own behavior and beliefs. His mind reeled. Every interaction, every word exchanged with Mark took on new meaning. He thought he was in control, that his journey of redemption was his own choice. But all along he'd been a pawn in a larger game. Why, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why go to such lengths? Jessica's expression softened. Because your father saw what you were becoming, Richard. He saw how far you'd strayed from the values he tried to instill in you. This was his way of trying to reach you, to show you what really matters in life. The revelation left him speechless. He thought back to his father, to the strained relationship they'd had in recent years. How many times had his father tried to talk to him, only to be brushed off or ignored? As the shock began to wear off, he was surprised to find that he wasn't angry. Instead, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. This elaborate plan, this test of character, it had given him a chance to become the man he always should have been. Weeks passed, and he continued his work at the shelter, his commitment unwavering despite the revelation. The knowledge that his journey was orchestrated didn't diminish its impact. If anything, it deepened his resolve to prove himself worthy of the lesson. Finally, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, he received a message from Mark. Time and place for a meeting. Nothing more. His heart raced as he read it, knowing that this could be his final test. The appointed day arrived, and he found himself in a quiet park away from the bustle of the city. Mark was already there, seated on a bench, his posture relaxed, but alert. As he approached, he felt the weight of the past weeks, of every choice that had led him to this moment. Mr. Harrington. Mark greeted him, his voice neutral. Please, he said. Call me Richard. Mark nodded, gesturing for him to sit. For a moment they sat in silence, the tension between them now replaced by a newfound understanding. I know about the plan, he said, finally. About you and my father. Mark didn't seem surprised, he simply nodded, his eyes never leaving his face. And how do you feel about that? He asked. He took a deep breath, considering his answer carefully. Grateful, he said finally. I was lost, Mark, so lost in my own ego and self-importance that I couldn't see what I was becoming all of this. It opened my eyes, a small smile tugged at the corner of Mark's mouth. That was the hope, he admitted. He shook his head, still amazed at the intricacy of the plan. I see now that wealth means nothing without compassion, he said softly, all those years chasing success. And I never realized what true richness really is. Mark nodded, a knowing glint in his eye. Sometimes, he said, his voice gentle, but firm, the richest lessons come from the poorest places. The words hit him with the force of revelation. He looked out over the park, seeing it with new eyes. The carefully manicured lawns and expensive landscaping faded away, replaced by the faces of those he'd met at the shelter, each one a story, each one a lesson in humanity. Thank you, he said, turning back to Mark, for not giving up on me, for giving me the chance to learn this lesson. Mark's smile widened slightly. The lesson was always there, Richard. You just needed to be ready to learn it. As they sat there sharing a moment of mutual respect and understanding, he felt a profound sense of peace. The journey wasn't over, he knew. He had a lifetime of learning and growth ahead of him. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. The sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park. He and Mark stood ready to go their separate ways. But before they parted, Mark extended his hand. He took it, the handshake, a symbol of the bridge they'd built between two worlds. As he walked away, he felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of expectations, of constant competition and self-aggrandizement, had lifted. In its place was a new sense of purpose, a commitment to using his resources and influence for the betterment of others. He knew the road ahead won't be easy. Old habits die hard, and there will be times when he'll be tempted to fall back into his old ways. But now, armed with the lessons he'd learned and the connections he'd made, he was ready to face those challenges for the first time in his life. He understood what it truly meant to be rich.